The topic on which he'll speak today, world trade and global governance. So over the past 20 years, we have witnessed systematic transformations in the nature and composition of global trade. And these changes have created unique opportunities and challenges for the evolution of global governance. For example, developing countries steadily augmented their presence in global trading networks. The rapid shift in economic power to the east and the south has transformed global leadership dynamics, with countries like China, India, Brazil, and Mexico increasingly shaping policy direction. These changes have created a more equitable representation of global economic power, yet they've also led to policy gridlock. As more nations join the global economy and grow in economic power, it will continue to be imperative to design institutional rules that govern the growth of trade in ways that ensure its benefits are widely shared. Other challenges have been and continue to be created, like the proliferation of regional trade agreements. So more generally, insights from the challenges and opportunities that international economic policymakers have faced in supervising past transformations in global trade are essential for understanding policy responses to changes in the global economy in the future. So the World Trade Organization has, of course, been central in these debates over global governance. During his two-term tenure at the helm of the WTO, from 2005 to 2013, Pascal Lamy successfully guided the organization through complex changes in structure and regulation of international trade. Among his many achievements, Mr. Lamy oversaw the systematic integration of developing countries into positions of political leadership in the world economic order. Yet Mr. Lamy's legacy extends beyond the WTO. As a policymaker at the national, pan-European, and international level, and through his experiences in both the public and private sector, Mr. Lamy has obtained an acute understanding of the factors that are required for creating effective systems of global governance. After serving in a variety of civil service positions in the French government, Mr. Lamy was, between 1985 and 1994, the Chief of Staff for the President of the European Commission. In 1994, he joined the team in charge of the recovery of the French bank Crédit Lyonnais, later becoming its CEO up to its privatization in 1999. He then returned to the European Commission, having been appointed as Commissioner of Trade. After a short sabbatical period as president of a think tank focusing on European integration, Mr. Lamy was named the Director General of the WTO. Mr. Lamy has been decorated with medals of honor from countries ranging from France to Mexico and has received honorary degrees from 8 universities around the world. He's the author of several books, most recently, and in part the topic of today's discussion, at Cambridge University Press, The Geneva Consensus, Making Trade Work for All. Today, Mr. Lamy will speak on the necessary mix of economic, social, and political policies that will determine the efficacy of free trade as an engine of global economic growth, as well as on the features of modern politics that create governance gridlock and thwart international cooperation. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Mr. Pascal Lamy.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for this invitation. I will try and, as briefly as possible, introduce our discussion on this topic, which I've been saddled with today, which is world trade and global governance. And I'll make 3 main points. Number one, that if you look at the big picture, world trade governance is in relatively good shape. Second point will be that looking ahead, there are new and major challenges for world trade governance. And the third point will be about how can we better address these future challenges based on the experience of the past. And as Ken just said, for those of you who want to read a bit more or know a bit more, the sort of three most recent pieces I have contributed to is this book about world trade, which was published at the end of last year at Cambridge University Press, which is the title of which is the Geneva Consensus, Making Trade Work for All. The second one, and I'll refer to that in my remarks, is the Oxford Martin School report, which is the report of a big worldwide group of personalities I had the privilege to chair during 18 months, and which is about how to address future generation challenges, which is a wide topic. And the last one on global governance is a lecture I gave in November at Brookings, the Raymond Aron lecture, where I basically stated my own thinking at this stage on this important issue. Now, starting with where is world trade governance in this big landscape of global governance? My point on this is that world trade governance is in relatively good shape, relatively. We all know, and I won't expand too much on that, the structural weaknesses of global governance. I think we will all agree that as compared to the global challenges this planet and its population is facing, there is a global governance deficit. I think this is conventional wisdom. The problem being that the reasons why we have this global governance deficit are pretty structural. There's no easy way out. There's no simple solution to fix this discrepancy between a rapidly globalizing planet, at least on the economic side, and important challenges, whether they are environment, whether they are migrations, whether they are pandemics, whether they are financial regulation issues, whether they are human rights. Now, there are, as I said, good reasons for this global system of governance to remain relatively weak. What governance is about in any system, whether it's association, whether it's corporate, whether it's a political system, governance should provide for leadership, for results. So there is a sort of efficiency criteria, and for legitimacy, which is a major issue. Now, on these three grounds, global governance has problems. Leadership, question mark, who's the leader? In the international system, we've had periods where there's been a leader. They usually haven't been the best periods in history, at least judged from a moral point of view. In terms of efficiency, we all know that this international system, which started basically at the end of the 19th century, seriously in political terms after the Second World War and the second wave of organization of which followed the Second World War, the First World War having done its step. This system is based on the sovereignty of roughly 200 nation states, who, according to the good old Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, are sovereign nations. Sovereignty meaning that they can or not accept to enter into agreements that then discipline, in a way limit the sovereignty, but they only do that by their own will. And by the way, once they've done that, they sometimes can relent on these commitments at some cost. If you read carefully the Vienna Convention on Treaties, which is the sort of pillar of international public law, you'll see that, yes, when you've entered into a treaty, which is a contract, you have to abide by what you accepted to do or not do, but, you know, you can, at some stage, move back from that, again, at some cost. But this system remains very scattered. And if you look at the system of international organization that has been built, again, starting with technical organizations like Postal Union or the Union for Telegraphic Transmission at the end of the 19th century, until the very last bits of the edifice of international organizations like the International Criminal Court, it's a system where sovereign members decide to enter into respective commitments, and this is administered through specialized international organizations. So you've got trade, you've got health, you've got labor, social issues, you've got food, you've got telecoms, you've got financial system, you've got development issues. But this system of organizations is not in itself producing what a governance system should provide, which is a coherence among these various remits. Or, to put it in a different way, the coherence within this international governance system remains in the hands of the members who drive these institutions. There's a sort of a theory that sovereign nation states, because they are sovereign, are coherent, and that what they do together in the international system automatically produce or reproduces the coherence they have, a sort of transitivity of coherence for those of you who've done a bit of mathematics. That's the theory of the system. The reality being, as we all know, that this is a fiction. When you look at how the system works, when you look at how these sovereign nation states behave, in many cases, they are incoherent. They will say something in the ILO, and they'll say something different in the WTO, and then they'll say something different at the board of the IMF or the board of the World Bank, not to talk about FAO or the Meteorological Organization. And when somebody like, for instance, the leader of one of these international organizations goes to say, well, you know, maybe there's a problem there, you, and I know that because I was sometime in this position, you're told, none of your business. Coherence is our privilege. We decide what is coherent and not coherent. And in this sense, by the way, national sovereignty sometimes can be described as the monopoly of incoherence, which of course doesn't automatically create a good international system as we would think it in this field. Now, the last reason why there is a big problem with international governance, which in my view is the most fundamental problem, I mean, the other issues in a way can be approximated one another, is legitimacy. And that's a fundamental problem. As we all know, in politics, legitimacy has a lot to do with proximity. If I accept a system of political power, I do that because I believe that the group I belong to necessitates some sort of collective order, and there's going to be a trade-off between what I surrender in my own personal sovereignty in the name of the group being run in a way that, for instance, protects me from some dangers. So, in many ways, this is all the more understood that it has to do with a sense of belonging. And no surprise, if you look at this under this angle, that, for instance, small countries are much easier to run than big countries. And that's a fact, I think, of life. That's what I sometimes call the canoe effect. When you're on a small boat, the notion that one of us is going to start rocking the boat creates a sort of immediate reaction from the rest of the crew on that boat, sort of stop rocking the boat, because we will all have a big problem if you keep doing that. And we all know that this sort of collective discipline is much harder, much tougher on a small boat than on a big boat. Now, back to this legitimacy problem. Inevitably, global governance suffers from the distance from the system of power, and disciplines, rules, and the enforcement of that has to do with power, and this sense of belonging. I'm sure a few of us in this room would define themselves as citizens of the world. The notion that we belong to a sort of global human community is not something totally strange for some of us, but the reality is that belonging remains first and most local, regional, national, and the European experience, and we might come back to that later in the discussion, is a good example of how tough it is to create a sort of supranational sense of belonging. Now, all this being said, and explaining basically why we shouldn't expect global governance to resemble, to emulate, to be similar to what local national governance is like. If you look at these structural weaknesses, in many ways, the World Trading System, GATT, and then WTO, is relatively efficient, is relatively solid, has produced results, has produced some sort of leadership, and has resulted in a sort of de facto legitimacy, even if there remains questions here and there. The traditional way of building governance through this member-driven system, as I said, is rules, disciplines, obligations, which sovereign nation states accept. And the reality is that if you look at the stock of rules, if you look at what's been agreed in trade issues, mostly about opening trade and resisting protectionism, that compares pretty well in trade as what you have on environment or on financial regulations or on migrations or on taxations or on human rights, which I have already mentioned. So compared to other global governance systems, that one ranks, performs relatively well, good stock of rules, a solid system for surveillance of these rules, for enforcement of these rules. The system of WTO is not just about having a rule book, if necessary, amending the rule book, although that sometimes is difficult, but it's about implementing the rule book. And there is a whole system, a whole machinery of surveillance, of administration of these rules, which is much more solid than in many other areas. And on top of all that, the WTO system has a dispute settlement system, which is part of the rules enforcement, but which gives to a judicial system, the dispute settlement system, a capacity to determine who's right and who's wrong in case of a litigation, which is much stronger than in many other organizations, not least because, to the difference of international public law, if there's a dispute within the WTO system and a country loses a dispute against another country, then the determination of the quote-unquote judge, and I say quote-unquote because diplomats don't like appellate body members in the WTO to be called judges. This is a bit too far from their Westphalian horizon. Then the country who loses a case is obliged to abide by the determination, and if the country doesn't abide by the determination, then there are possibilities of trade sanctions, which of course are a strong rule and system of enforcement. So on these three grounds, the existence of rules and disciplines, which is one thing, the capacity to administer them, and it's fine to have rules, but if they're not, you don't have a system that makes sure that they are implemented, these rules are not much worth, and the ultimate solution, that is, go to the judge for interpreting the rules. On the three grounds, in many ways, the World Trading System, GATT, then WTO, and the dispute settlement system, the compulsory nature of the dispute settlement system was a distinctive feature of the WTO as compared to its predecessor, the GATT. The system, again, is relatively strong. And this is why, basically, it has, in terms of efficiency, produced results which are to be expected from a proper governance system. If you look at the evolution of world trade, the mission of this global trading system being to open trade, to address obstacles to trade, the numbers are the jury, and trade is formidably more open than it was when this system started. And by the way, it has extremely well met the test of resilience with the economic and social crisis, financial, economic, and then social crisis that started here in the US in 07, 08. This major shock on the world economy, the first real major global shock on the world economy with a magnitude which was unprecedented, but for the example of the 1930s, but which was mostly transatlantic, hasn't resulted in any significant protectionist surge, as opposed to what happened in the 1930s. And this is largely, if not only, largely due to the existence of the disciplines and to the capacity of the system to make sure that these disciplines were respected, including the initiative I took in 08 to ask the G20 for a mandate of producing 2 times or 3 times a year a sort of radar screen picture of all trade policy measures in all countries going either in the right direction or in the wrong direction in order to be able to create a sort of name and shame pressure on the members of WTO. So in many ways, if you look at things as they are today and as they have been, again, a relatively well-performing system, relatively. Doesn't mean that in itself the World Trade Governance System does not have some of the problems which other international institutions have, not least the problem of having to work by consensus, which of course is more and more of a problem as the number of parties playing the game of global trade, including in negotiations, has increased, which after all is extremely good news. In the past, GATT or WTO agreements used to be the product of, let's say, US, EU, Canada, Japan, sort of coming to a deal, and the rest of the membership would more or less accept that. This is a totally different game today. Again, very good news, because it means that the number of participants, stakeholders, has increased, but of course it doesn't make the life of negotiations easier. Plus the fact that the old software of the GATT, which was basically reciprocity in trade opening for rich countries and flexibilities for poor countries, which has been the sort of major software of trade negotiations during 40 or 50 years, has a problem with emerging countries. It's fine and easy to understand that, let's say, EU, US should be on par in terms of the way they open trade, and this should be based on proper reciprocity. It's not difficult to understand that Senegal or Cambodia or Laos or even Paraguay cannot, for the moment, play this game, which is based on competition, and that they deserve specific regimes with basically, in which basically they have to open trade less than the big guys, while benefiting from the trade opening which the big guys have negotiated among them. So that's a sort of reasonable pattern. The problem being that when you've got countries who are emerging, this old game where rich countries were powerful and poor countries were weak is not there anymore. And if it's about, for instance, what's the proper trade regime of China, is China a rich country like US and EU, but with many poor, a bit like Senegal, or is China a poor country like Senegal, or Laos with many rich like in the US or EU? Depending on how you answer this question, the sort of trade regime which you will believe is fair is fundamentally different. If China is a rich country with many poor, then the Chinese system should be like EU-US, but with a bit of flexibility. If China is a poor country with many rich, then the Chinese system, trade regime, should be like Senegal or Laos, but with a bit of reciprocity. And of course, the whole issue of the around sort of bumped into what is that bit? Is it a small bit? Is it a middle bit? Is it a big bit? And this question, for the moment, is the one that has clogged a number of traditional trade negotiations. Now, moving to my second point, looking at the future of world trade opening, of the world trade regime, of the world trade governance. I believe that what I just said, which is okay for the past and the present to some extent, might look very different in the future. There are, in the transformations of world trade, there are challenges which will be pretty different from the ones the world trade governance system has had to cope with until now. And the reason for that is that the nature of trade, the patterns of trade, not why people trade, but how they trade, has quite fundamentally changed during the last decades. To put it very simply, and to some extent too simply, we've moved from an old situation where a country was producing something which was traded with another country. So the country producing would produce, export to this other country, who would import from the country where it was produced. And that's a system which has presided to the concept of how international trade works for centuries. this is not the way trade works today. Today, if you look at goods, which is not the largest part of international trade, at least measured in value addition, if you look at goods, roughly 2/3 of international trade in goods is in components, in spare parts, in bits and pieces. And by the way, this is roughly the same for services, although it takes a bit longer in the services production area to move to this multi-localization of production systems, which we have witnessed during the last 2 decades. In other words, things which were made in US or in Japan or in Germany are now made in the world. And goods, final goods or services are very often the result of the accumulation of successive production stages, which each of them adds a bit of value addition to create the final product. The reality being also that in this final product, this traditional difference we've made, at least conceptually, between goods and services becomes more and more blurred. If you take a tablet, which we all have to work with, is this thing, which is a thing, because you can take it in your hands. Is it a good or is it a service? When you look at where the value addition which has been created for you to pay the price of the thing, a vast majority of this value addition is about services and not about goods. So this transforms totally the system. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why I launched this big reform when I was WTO DG, which is trying to number international trade, not in volumes the way we've done it since Middle Ages, but in value addition, the same way as you do it for your GNP. This creates a situation where the traditional obstacle to trade, which basically were tariffs, are disappearing. And one of the reasons why they are disappearing is that if more and more of what you export comes from elements, whether goods or services, which you import, then shooting on your imports becomes pretty irrational. The average import content of exports worldwide was 20% 20 years ago, is today probably around 40%, and will probably be 60% 20 years from now, as a result of this proliferation of global supply chains. So the moment, let's say, more than half of what you export are imports to which you have added value because you have a comparative advantage, then shooting on your imports makes absolutely no sense. So in many ways, this transformation of international trade, the reason of which has to do with the formidable crushing of the cost of distance with which technological changes have brought about, whether it's containerization or whether it's the internet, has given this technological change, which results in crushing the cost of distance, have given a sort of huge efficiency to the model which Adam Smith and David Ricardo have sort of created in their mind at the time, which is the advantage of exchanging stemming from comparative advantage. One of the reasons why the model they created did not result in a worldwide integration of trade during, let's say, 100 years, was that a part of the advantages of international division of labor was offset by the remaining cost of distance. You had to pay a lot to ship goods, and you still, by the way, have to pay a lot, if not to ship goods, at least to cross some borders, which is why this trade facilitation with the WTO agreement, which the WTO succeeded in concluding at the end of last year, is so important. If that's correct, and I think that's the way ahead, at least that's what numbers say, that's what business tells us is the way it works today, then the nature of obstacle to trade is changing, and hence the mission of the global governance system of trade is changing. Why is the nature of obstacle to trade changing? Because traditional obstacle to trade, like tariffs, the purpose of which was to protect your domestic producer from foreign competition, is vanishing. Tariffs are historically dead. There'll still be tariffs for some time ahead for various countries and in various circumstances, but, you know, for instance, the average trade-weighted tariff worldwide today is around 4 to 5%, whereas it was 40% after the Second World War. So this way of putting obstacle to trade is disappearing, even if we're still not there, but that's, in my view, the trend. And what matters now is not measures that countries would take to protect their producer from foreign competition, but measures that countries take more and more, and will keep more and more taking to protect their consumer from risks. Or more precisely, the obstacle to trade may not be so much in the measure through which countries protect their consumers through various regulatory systems on food safety, on car safety, on prudential rules for banking or insurance. But the real obstacle to trade lies in the difference between these measures. Let me take one example. Assume I'm a Rwandan producer of cut flowers. In the past, in order to export my flowers to US, EU, Japan, I had to pay a tariff. Now, it's now 0. So I have no problem with tariffs at all, because Japan, EU, US, for a variety of reasons, import cut flowers from Rwanda duty-free, quota-free. But if I want to export my cut flowers to Japan, US, or EU, I will have to match a test, which is done at the border of US, EU, or Japan, and which is the verification of the US, EU, or Japanese standard on maximum pesticide residues, which is a sanitary measure which countries legitimately make sure that they don't import flowers which would contain an inadmissible level of pesticide, because this is bad for human health and for various other good reasons. So if I'm a Rwandan producer of cut flower, my problem is not a tariff measure, it's what they call, in the WTO jargon, a non-tariff measure. Now, I will have to match this if I don't have a certificate that testifies that my flowers do not contain more than X micro, milli, whatever, of pesticides. I simply won't be able to export them. So I have to do that, and this I understand. But if I have a different system in US, EU, or Japan, whether it's because the maximum pesticide residue differs in the US, EU, or Japanese legislation, which is one possibility, or whether the way this maximum pesticide residue is measured checked the way I can get a certificate from the national inspection teams in US, EU, or Japan, that my production system fits this requirement, whether I have to pay $50,000 or $100,000 per year or per shipment is something that becomes of major importance. Now, this is the issue for the future. We can, I think, all agree that with levels of standard growing, with standard of living growing, more and more of these precautionary issues will be taken into account. Human health, environment, even animal welfare, why not? At least some are arguing for that. And this is the new game. In many ways, the new game will not be about protectionism, but about precautionism. And this is a very different game. Why? Because if you want to address these differences, it is in many ways much more complex. These precautionary measures are about risk management. They are about avoiding a risk. Now, avoiding a risk is linked to a scale between basically what's better and what's worse, which has to do, at the end of the day, with what's good and what's bad. And what's good and what's bad has a name. It is values. Now, economists will call this collective preferences. They don't want to mix too much economics and morals, contrary to their ancestors in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, or even 19th century. But these issues are much more complex to address collectively, globally, than the previous ones. If I have a tariff on scrap metal and you have a tariff on bicycles, it's pretty obvious that there's a good deal in sight if you reduce your tariff on bicycles and I reduce my tariffs on scrap metal. I will produce bicycles which are cheaper, and you will buy bicycles which are cheaper, and you will probably sell more of your scrap metal, because my own producers who produce scrap metal but who are less efficient than yours will have to disappear. So that's in many ways, ideologically neutral. Of course, it creates a problem with my domestic producers of scrap metal, and it probably will create a bit of a problem with your domestic producers of bicycle, but at the end of the day, we both will agree that it's rational. If it's about how much GMOs I accept in my food and how much GMOs you accept in your food, then you move to a totally different ground. Because whether GMOs are great or not, as you know, is a highly debated topic, depending on history, culture, science, regulations, your risk management culture, depending whether you believe that managing risk is authorizing what's not forbidden or forbidding what's not authorized, which may be sometimes a difference. This creates very different challenges for the global trading systems. It means that instead of negotiating just on the basis of things which you can measure with a price, which is the market, you have to negotiate things which have to do with your mind, with your dreams and your nightmares. And, trade-offs between scrap metal and bicycles are, again, easily understandable. Trade-offs between nightmares and dreams is something which is much more complex. And it raises a whole set of new challenges. For instance, in the political economy of trade negotiations, if I'm a trade negotiator and I negotiate tariffs, I know the name of the game. Producers, my domestic producers, will be against me, and my domestic consumers will be with me. It's a bit more complex because usually producers have a higher capacity to create noise than consumers, at least in this, that's my experience. But you basically know the rule of that game. Now, if I start negotiating regulatory convergence as a trade negotiator, the odds are that I will have the producers with me, because they will like the notion that there is a common standard. They can produce more, they can cash economies of scale, but the odds are that I will have the consumers against me, because the consumers will probably suspect that in negotiating a convergent standard with my counterpart on pesticide residues, for instance, I'll be inclined to lower a bit my standard in order to get a deal. So the suspicion in the system will be that this game is about regulatory dumping. Now, these are the politics of that. I mean, I have some experience in this area, my own bet. But when I say that to business people, it doesn't. They don't like it. My own bet is that the way these regulatory convergence negotiations will work is that it will, at the end of the day, align to the maximum of level of precaution and not the minimum level of precautions. And one of the reasons for that is that the actors of these negotiations will not be trade people who know absolutely nothing about maximum pesticide residues, or banking or insurance regulations, or the way you should declare a foot and mouth disease for whatever, or bovine in whatever province. This is done by specialized regulatory agencies, national, some of which are international. And my bet is that these regulators will have a difficulty in converging on a level of regulation, but that at the end of the day, where the balance will be is in accepting the highest level of precaution on various sides. And we will have a test of this in the negotiation that just started between US and Europe, this TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And the political premises of that, I think, show that, contrary to previous negotiations, civil society, consumer organizations, civil society organizations that have as a duty in modern societies the task of promoting this level of precaution, usually to increase it in order to protect populations and at least their members from increased risk, they will have a much bigger say in the negotiation. And my guess is that trade negotiators should be ready for that. Last point, if that's correct, that if the name of the game of trade governance, trade negotiations, stemming from this difference in the way trade happens, which itself creates a difference in the way you have to address obstacles to trade, what's the way ahead? How could this be addressed in such a way that the gains that have accrued for opening trade, which are undisputable for the last 50 years, even if there has been costs here and there, and economics is a system where there is no gain without pain and the other way around, then we have to try and think of what's the proper model for addressing this. And on this, I draw some conclusions from this Oxford Martin report, which I already mentioned, in which we looked during a year with a group of very solid experience, although diverse people worldwide at how global issues have been addressed for the last decades. The notion being that if you have to look at future decades, looking at what happened recently is a good way to start pragmatically. And what we've done is basically look at roughly 10 issues that worked reasonably well and 10 issues that miserably failed. That's the influence of the weather on the East Coast. For instance, why did HIV/AIDS work reasonably well? Why did the ozone layer issue work reasonably well? Why did Y2K work reasonably well? Whereas overfishing oceans has failed miserably. Financial regulation before the 07-08 was a big failure. Why does climate change stall at least negotiations on climate change as stemming from carbon emissions? Why is it stalling the way it stalls? So we've looked at each and every of these cases and tried to draw some lessons on how should we look at future challenges, some of which, by the way, like climate change, are immediate challenges. And one of the conclusions, there I won't enter into too many details, those of you who want to know more can look at the report, it's on the Oxford Martin School website. One of the conclusions was that where it worked was when multi-stakeholder coalitions were built so that not only sovereign nation states, but also civil society or business, usually big business more than small business, have coalesced together. HIV/AIDS being a good example, and more to come, for instance, in these Gavi, this Global Alliance for Vaccines in developing countries. In other words, as compared to the main features I described a moment ago on global governance, which is international relations being in the hand of sovereign nation states who, in a way, have the monopoly of international relation rules or actions. What works is when you demonopolize international relations from the rule of sovereign nation states. Hence, involving not only nation states, very often now sub-national entities, such as cities. If you look at the planet today, you probably have 100 mayors who have more power than half of the members of the UN General Assembly. These people are extremely down to earth, and they have to run the problems of their municipalities. And many of these problems of the municipalities, given the growing role of megacities, are becoming or have become global problems. So the probable best way to address this is to build up these coalitions. And in the various suggestions which we've made in this Oxford Martin report, for instance, on climate change, we suggest to build a coalition, which we call C20, 30, 40, between 20 countries, i.e. the ones who are responsible for 90% of carbon emissions, and already a group of 20 countries, who's called the G20, 30 big multinationals whose interest is in having a predictable rule for carbon emissions in the future, because this matters a lot for their own business, And there is already a group of 30 multinationals who's working actively on climate change in various directions, and 40 cities, mega cities, and there is already a group of 40 mega cities who's working on climate change, which, by the way, had its annual meeting 2 weeks ago in South Africa. So these three groups exist. The question is, and our view, our suggestion is that if you put them around the table, and if they come to an agreement, then the rest of the problems, which has been so far totally insoluble in the UNFCCC, where the climate change negotiations are happening, between 200 sovereign countries, but who can get consensus on nothing, this might lead to a coalition, a convergence, an agreement that then will bring the rest of the stakeholders in line. And I think if I relate this to what I said on global trade, I think this means that a part of this regulatory convergence will have to be done on the basis of such coalitions. Now, I know full well that it's a bit of a provocative provocation intellectually to say that civil society or business could, in a way, trigger regulatory convergence. But when you look at where the stakeholders' interests are, and notably if it's about, let's say, precaution, then I think this is the right way forward. And by the way, you probably have had some sort of a premise of this with this agreement in Bali in WTO at the end of last year on trade facilitation. And one of the reasons why it worked, and I wrote in that book that I wrote in June and July last year that Bali would work, precisely because there has been a coalition of interest between big businesses, small businesses, and they are very well represented in the International Chamber of Commerce, which had a big role in pushing for this border simplification agreement. And that's probably one indication that we are moving in this direction. So, whether this model of coalitions is the only one, I'm not saying is the only one, but I think that's the way we should look at the future, and especially on trade negotiations, given what I said, what I believe are the transformations. To conclude, if that's correct, if my sort of understanding of the future is correct, it means that the phase we've had in globalization, let's say for sorry, the last decades, which have led to questions, and in my view, legitimate questions about how can you keep this very forceful movement of economic integration based on technological progress, whereas political systems, social systems, remain local, thus creating a risk, which Karl Poliani had extremely well described at the end of the Second World War in this big piece of his, The Great Transformation, which was the notion that there is a risk of disembedding the economic system from society, and which I think is a risk, at least according to my own political views. The paradox may be that in the future, for globalization to keep working, for market capitalism to keep globalizing with the pluses and some of the minuses it has, it probably will need to invest in this field of values. So the notion that you can keep economic integration without having to step on issues which have to do with society, with politics, with values, I think the system will need to penetrate into this area, hence, in a way, re-embedding economic globalization and social systems. And we probably have reached a stage, if I'm correct, at least on what I know best, which is trade integration. There is an inbuilt necessity now for trade integration to keep producing the sort of benefits, again, not without any cost, it has created in recent decades, to move into the direction. And the way you do that is probably still very open, but I think this model coalition is probably the one we have to think of for the future. Thanks for your attention.
We have time for some questions, and if you look for, raise your hand, and we have a microphone that will.
Hello, my name is Ken Bernard. I had the pleasure of working with your staff and occasionally with you in Geneva as the political advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization when TRIPS was being discussed. I really like your approach to this integration, and I have for a long time, even through several more conservative administrations in the United States. The question I have has to do with your use of the term global governance. It's an unfortunate term because it's very close in English to global government, which offends every conservative in the Republican in the United States at least. So you end up with the problem of having to use as your symbol of action or your phrase that describes what you're doing a term that's actually loaded, especially here, and I don't know in Europe so much, but here. How can you see getting past that? Because the issues that you're actually discussing and the activities you want to move forward are perfectly compatible with that with the point of view of even the more conservative, economically oriented people. The problem being the phraseology and the fact that there's some supra-governmental decision makers or governors really sits in people's craws and actually slows progress down.
No, I think you're right. This global governance logo, which is what all of us who've been working on that for 20 years have been using, is loaded here in the US. Not elsewhere, by the way, but we all have our specificities, we all have our sort of sensitivities, and we all know that in the US, the philosophy of a relationship to the government from the very beginning has been specific. In Europe, this notion of global governance doesn't raise at all the same sort of sensitivities, not least because the difference between government and governance is much bigger in Europe than it is here. In Europe, if you say governance, people don't really understand what it means. When you say government, they do. And governance is a rather wobbly concept, although its etymology is pretty clear. It comes from Latin gubernator, which is the way you drive a boat. But it's a very different tradition. You're absolutely correct. But again, in this case, it's not the rest of the world which is specific, it's US which is specific. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a problem, given the size of this country and its importance in international relations. My own answer to that is, we have to get the narrative right. But, that's an important problem once you've got the substance right. So far, I don't think we've got the substance really right. Now, then the objection could be, yeah, but how can you get the substance right if your narrative is wrong? It will prevent from, addressing substantive problems. I accept that. And I think that if I had to, to sort of off the cuff to suggest something different, I would say something like, network governance, or something that gave the impression that it's much more decentralized. And by the way, this coalition model, which we evidence in this Oxford Martin report, is in some way a decentralization of governance and power. It's a way, and I've changed my mind on this with experience. When I wrote a book in, what was 10 years ago on world democracy, and at the time my view was that we should look at how can we properly globalize local problems. Now, on this I've changed my mind, and the reason why this coalition system for me is very attractive is that it's a way to localize global problems. And it addresses, in my view, much better this fundamental problem of legitimacy. Because if you work on the basis of these coalitions, the various stakeholders in the coalition are much nearer to, let's say, the one that mandate them, even if it may deserve a bit of a caution in some areas. So I agree with you. We might have to find a sort of a better narrative. But if we move in the direction of these coalitions, again, it's the Latin sense of governance that will be appropriate. And after all, maybe we can find something which is more user-friendly from this side of the Atlantic.
I have a question over here.
Thank you. So a quick question. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what do you perceive is going to be the impact of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Negotiation on the core of global trade, that's the World Trade Organization? And second question that is basically, you're talking about three phenomena. One is the fragmentation of the free trade regime into different initiatives. One, the regionalism or preferentialism, as was described in the previous report of the World Trade Organization. The informal lawmaking that you just, or decentralization that you just referred. And a third phenomenon, I like the way that you put it, the precautionism. That transfers a lot of power to the judges, right? Because the dispute settlement body is the one that's going to decide conflicts of rules between these three different initiatives, the conflicts of assessments of values, and determine what informal lawmaking is valid under the system and what is not. So what do you think is the future also of the appellate body? So those are the questions.
Okay, why don't we take a few questions so that I can proportion the size of my answer to the number of questions. I'll note them all and I'll answer them all.
I am very happy to hear that the social aspect is being taken into account, and that the thinking, but being totally not just hearing the three examples of the three initiatives that worked and three that didn't, or three programs, I have a kind of off-the-cuff reaction that in first case, the ones that worked, there was really no money or serious money that business had to put out. And in the ones like climate change, others, those are major expenses. And like with safety belts or whatever else, business is going to fight it as much as they can. But that's totally, I am not from the field, and just a gut reaction.
Yes, can I just add one other question? you say, and I agree entirely, that the level of tariffs now is so low that that's not a major impediment for a lot of trade, although clearly there are some areas where tariffs are still quite high. But one of the things that's occurred to me about the attraction of regional agreements is that you do actually have a target, zero tariff. Okay, and you may go over 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, or whatever, but at least you've got a target. Is it possible that you can think of a target in the case of the WTO that you can say, let's have zero tariffs in 5 years' time, 15 years, or whatever? Is that feasible? And if so, would that give a little bit of, would regenerate a bit of the enthusiasm for the multilateral system?
Okay. No more? On the first question, this question about regionalism, bilateral versus multilateral, hundreds and thousands of pages have been written on this, including by scholars, including here in Stanford, where there's a relatively good school of thought on this. My own take on that is very simple. If you look at how it's worked for the last 50 years, and let's look at how it works rather than how it should work, there has been a de facto synergy, convergence between bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade opening. So all these precautions about trade diversion, Article 24, GATT, and so on, I understand on a theoretical point of view, but in reality, it has worked, and the fundamental reason why it has worked was that it was mostly about market opening, was mostly about tariff reductions in goods, and that the more bilateral preference you spread in the system, the less preference there is at the end of the day. So there is a sort of inbuilt convergence. Now, that's for the past. If I'm right in believing that for the future the game is about regulatory convergence, the question whether this is done bilaterally or multilaterally reopens. Because there is something like a potential regulatory convergence issue in regulatory preference. Now, there's nothing like the world regulatory preference in WTO agreements, but it's something of this kind. And on this, I think the jury is out. Whether big elephants like EU-US, I don't think TPP will be seriously about regulatory convergence. TPP will be about relatively classical issues. There might be a bit more on IP, on state-owned enterprises, on public procurement. But I don't think TPP, at this stage at least, will lead to a sort of common standard for the safety of lighters or toys. That's too wide a system. And, I mean, if it was to be the case, it would be pretty obvious if I'm from Malaysia or from Vietnam, I will have to accept the US standard, which politically is sometimes a bit too much to swallow. Whereas if you look at how you can open trade between US and EU, obviously 80% of the problem is on regulatory convergence. Now, in order to, so I have no answer to this question. It may be that it will work towards multilateral, or it may be that it could lead to regulatory blocks. And if you listen to some, and don't ask me for names, in the US on this, there is a sort of view that, if we do that properly with Europe, then China will have no choice but to join this standard. So there is a sort of power game, which is let's use the supremacy we have in regulation today in order to create what de facto will become a worldwide standard. Now, whether, again, it will work in one direction or not, I don't know, but I would take a sort of, I would hedge this in giving to the WTO a global mandate of overseeing regulatory convergence, so that the fact that at the end of the day it has to be multilateral is politically recognized. And if I were an African country, or Brazil, or India, I would ask for that in order to make sure that I will have my say at some stage. Now, maybe we're not there yet, but I think this is the proper way of addressing this. On the dispute settlement body, of course, there is always a danger of governmental judges if the legislator doesn't do properly his job. And that's, I mean, if you have a rule book that hasn't been amended for 20 years, inevitably new issues will raise, with the judge will interpret with the old rules, and there's a risk that the judge will create the law instead of the legislator. And I don't think it's a good system, at least from a legitimacy point of view. If you look at the way the jurisprudence of the dispute settlement body of the WTO has worked since it was created in '94, the reality is that the jurisprudence gives more and more space for these value-based precautions, not the other way around. And for those of you who are specialists, if you look at the jurisprudence on like products or on process and production methods, it's gone in this direction. So in many ways, one could say, and I speak with precaution, but that the WTO judge is a bit ahead of the curve as compared to the Westphalian animals that are meant to drive the WTO on these issues which are connected with values. On the coalition system with business, I'm not sure I would agree that it works where business doesn't have to put big money. I mean, I'm not surprised that big business is looking at where it makes money. My experience is that, take climate change, for instance. If you are in the business of energy, of food production, of global supply chain logistics, whether there's going to be a price for carbon or not is a big strategic thing for me. And it will probably determine whether it's at this price or that price, or whether there's a price at all, my profitability 20 or 30 years from now. So it's not a question that, big business is not after making money. That's by definition. But it may be their interest to address these problems. And if you take the example of HIV/AIDS, for instance, there was a big debate within the pharma industry on the issue of tiered pricing, for instance, of tiered pricing, which is pricing medicines for HIV, AIDS differently depending on the level of development of the country. And at the time, and I know that because I was closely associated to that, there was a big debate. Some of them said, no way, I'm going to lose money in pricing that at zero or quasi. Others were saying, you're stupid. If you don't do that, you're going to be bashed. Your intellectual property system will explode under the pressure of civil society. Let's make money where consumers can pay. And let's sell at marginal price, which is zero or quasi-zero in this sort of case, where we have to do it. And at the end of the day, the argument was won by people not who decided not to make money, but who convinced the other one that the proper way to make money in the future was to sell at zero or quasi-zero in developing countries. So I think it's more complex than that. On the prospect for sort of WTO agreement on zero tariff, I mean, if people were rational, that's what they would do. And they would say, we all agree the horizon is zero, and then we discuss on the timing. That would be much simpler, but it's far too simple for diplomats. Far too simple for diplomats. That would be, the game would be so easy, so open, and what would be the sort of differences and how you could converge, you wouldn't need diplomats anymore. And these guys, they know the pie they're after, and it wouldn't work. So I think it's a very clever idea, and I always said, and I already said that during a discussion we had with a few students at lunch, that if we were to be rational, we would say trade is open, and we discuss when it is not open. Instead of doing what has been done for the last 50 years, which is starting from where we were, which is trade not open, and making trade-offs on how to open it. That would make much more sense. The problem being that, as we all know, politics are not rational, which in many ways is what they sometimes have charm, and they sometimes can create situations which rationality would not create. But so, in a nutshell, excellent idea, but too rational for politics. Good? Fine.
So it seems to me that from an economic standpoint, the precautionary measures are going to have the same ultimate impact on the price of the product as a tariff would, because they're going to increase the cost of testing, of systems, and how that product is to produce to make sure that it's safe for the consumer according to whatever standards they're coming up with. Has anybody taken that into account and measured the price increase? And for example, if aflatoxin levels in Europe have to be under a certain percentage, does that increase the price of the product by 20%? And how do you compare that with tariffs?
No, I think it's again, it's a good rational question. But that's not the way it happens in politics. If you think pesticides are bad for your health, if you have this nightmare that you're going to become sick because of pesticides, you're not going to make a sort of opportunity economic test calculation of how much does it cost to forbid pesticide residues. It's much stronger than that. It's much stronger than economics. So it doesn't work this way. Of course, there is always a risk that this precaution administration is at least marginally manipulated by producers' interests, and there's a gray zone there which we need to be aware of. But I don't think that's the way it will happen. I mean, I think an economist could calculate it, like economists have been calculating, and they've been doing this for a very long time, comparing the impact on trade on non-tariff measures as compared to tariff measures, and there's abundant literature and amount of research on this, but I think this is not the way decisions will be taken. But where it makes sense is in addressing the cost of regulatory discrepancies. There it makes sense. What is the best price ratio of how to address regulatory discrepancies? That's a real issue. And I think it does make sense If you compare, for instance, harmonization and mutual recognition, who are the two avenues to regulatory convergence, they all have a different path, they all have different costs. The repartition of the cost between between consumers on different markets may be different. So my answer to your question is, I don't think it makes sense in absolute. Nobody is going to, again, to proportion the risk assessment or the risk management to what it costs. But what can be assessed is how to address in the most cost-effective way, i.e. for the consumer to benefit of it, the problem of regulatory discrepancies.
All right. So two things. First of all, there's a short reception that you're all invited to just in the lobby afterwards, and we can continue the conversation there. And then finally, I just want you to join me in thanking Pascal for a fantastic talk in a world in which we always see visions of governance failure, a pretty positive vision for the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks.